This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 40 of season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, October 7th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mr. and Mrs. Walter Cutter are rejoicing over the advent of a baby daughter into their home, come to join a family of 3 brothers. Her name was Florence A. Cutter, born October 2nd, 1911. Miss Martha Hildreth and her mother, Mrs. James Hildreth, maiden name Sarah Rebecca Tenney, have come to spend the winter with Mrs. Fletcher Perkins. It says Perkins here, but in fact it should be Peckens, Peckens. Mrs. Fletcher Peckins, maiden name Elizabeth Porter Tobie, Tobie, and her sister, Miss Lucy Tobie. Mrs. Hildreth is 93 years old, the oldest woman in town. Mrs. Peckins is 85, and Miss Tobie is 79, which makes quite a household of elderly members. Miss Ruth Fisher has been obliged to have a leave of absence from her school duties, having been seriously threatened with a nervous breakdown, arrest and change of scene being ordered by her physician. Miss Clara Smith and Miss Edith Foster are substituting at the Frost School in Miss Fisher's place. Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Hall and Miss Marion Hall, who was their 25-year-old daughter, leave this next week to spend the winter in California. They have relatives in Pasadena and Los Angeles, and their son, Harry Hall, who is in California, will spend the winter with his parents. Miss Marion has secured a nice position to occupy herself with while there. Master John Gill Fletcher has been suffering with abscesses in both ears and was taken to Lowell by Dr. Wells one day last week for special treatment by a specialist. Mrs. John B. Fletcher, who has been in the habit of spending her winters in Chelmsford, will remain in her own home this winter, and Miss Delia Wheeler is to stay with her as companion and helper. Mrs. Sarah Drew, who has been suffering with an attack of bronchial pneumonia, is much better and making good recovery. Mrs. George Whitney is ill at her home, suffering with abscess of the stomach. The net proceeds of the recent agricultural fair were about $150. E. S. Raymond, who was such a good friend of our town library, has recently presented some beautiful volumes of Japanese art, which are most attractive and well worth perusal. The first meeting of the Tadmont Club will be held on Tuesday afternoon, October 11th, at the Unitarian Vestry at 3 o'clock. The meeting is in charge of Miss Marion Sweat, Mrs. Cyril Blaney, and Miss Winifred Burnham. It is to be a, quote, home afternoon, end quote, and members will answer the roll call with useful household hints, also historical stories of the town. The ladies will bring their sewing and help make this an informal affair. A musical program has been arranged, and club tea will be served. Charles D. Colburn, who so seriously injured his left hand in an ensilage cutter 2 weeks ago, is making as good progress with the injury toward recovery as can be expected. I find that kind of a comment not very helpful because he was pretty badly injured. The Westford Board of Trade held a well-attended meeting at the town hall on Wednesday evening. The committee for a descriptive pamphlet of the town reported, and the pamphlet is outlined by them, was ordered printed. This is to contain views and reading matter with advertising, the latter to defray the expense of its getting up. Those in charge of oiling streets reported that it was stated that fully half of the expense had been met by private subscription, the rest to be met by the town. This oiling has proved itself a good thing. The Edward M. Abbott Hose Company held its regular monthly meeting on Tuesday evening. About a dozen hydrants were opened and tried out, and later a business meeting was held at their headquarters. Next, we have the About Town section. Eben A. Wood of Nicholville, New York, has been making a short visit to his relative, Miss Loker, at the Providence Farm. He has been correspondent for a Potsdam paper for 25 years. As such, he has preserved his correspondence, which has been gathered into several volumes. The youngest daughter of Mrs. Robarge of West Chelmsford has scarlet fever. They formerly lived at Brookside. George Perkins, who has been superintendent of the Nabnasset Farm for 8 years for George C. Moore, has bought a 40-acre farm in Paxton, Worcester County, and moved into it. The family will be missed around Brookside and West Chelmsford for their good, wholesome, companionable ways. Charles P. Mason, employed at the Reed Farm, has been seriously ill and removed to the Lowell Hospital. Andrew Sackett, a farmer section master on the H.E. Fletcher Railroad, has been visiting old friends on Oak Hill and West Chelmsford. Mrs. George H. Whitney is seriously ill at her home on East Main Street, corner of Providence Road. Congratulations to George Howard on the arrival of new hopes and promises. That's a reference to his newborn son, Philip Robbins Howard, born September 28th in Littleton. May it prove medicine to Grandpa Calvin Howard in recovering from his recent accident. Charles Watts has left the employ of the Brookside Mills, where he has been employed many years, and has moved to Clinton in the employ of Paul Wise, a former superintendent of the Brookside Mills. There were a number of mills in Clinton also. The obituary notice of Dr. John Scott Mason, which appeared in last week's issue and making his winter home in Westford, has led the writer, as well as Westford, to inquiring, "Who art thou?" In other words, he never heard of John Scott Mason before. And the writer of this piece was Sam Taylor, of course. The next section is the Westford Grange section. It's the Grange section. It's not the Westford Grange. Middlesex North Pomona Grange held its monthly meeting with North Reading Grange on Friday of last week. The address of welcome was given by Chester Hayward of the local Grange, response by Reverend James Danforth of Tingsboro, chaplain of the Pomona Grange. The following question was handed out for general discussion. Which is more serviceable to a farmer, practical knowledge gained by experience or knowledge gained from agricultural books and papers? Afternoon session was an address by Elmer Stevens, Treasurer of the Commonwealth. His address fitted closely the appropriateness of speaker and hearers on the subject of, quote, state expenditures, end quote. This was followed by music and papers. At 6:30, the degree of Pomona was conferred on a large class of candidates. The next paragraph is entitled Temperance Meeting. The semi-annual meeting of the Middlesex Northwest Temperance Union will be held in the Congregational Church, Westford, on Thursday, October 12th, commencing at 9:45, with devotional service by Reverend David Wallace of Westford. The vote in Maine and its bearing on the temperance cause at large will be discussed by Reverend Silas N. Adams of Concord Junction and Reverend George M. Howe of Groton. At 10:45, an address will be given by Reverend Herbert Johnson, president of the Anti-Saloon League, on the, quote, the Anti-Saloon League and its work, end quote. General discussion at 1:30. Praise service, Reverend Edgar Crossland, South Acton. At 2:15, an address on temperance by Reverend George F. Kengott of Lowell, followed by general discussion. The next paragraph is titled To Be Closed. The Nabnasset Farm will take on the evidence of closing, as the owner has decided to close down for the present. This is one of the largest hay-producing farms in Westford, it being made a specialty. It is located at the outlet of Nabnasset Lake. On the east, the lake outlet passing through the center of the farm and close to the farm buildings, thence on to Stony Brook, and thence by canal from West Chelmsford to the mills owned by Mr. Moore at North Chelmsford. With the closing of the farm will also be the closing of the boathouse. The farm has several hundred acres of park forestry surrounding Namnasset Lake. The next paragraph is titled the WCTU meeting, that being the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU held its October meeting with Mrs. Emma Day, Cold Spring and Graniteville Road, on Wednesday afternoon with 12 members present. That's still where the Day family lives. Mrs. Janet Wright, the president, presided. After the usual routine business, arrangements were made for the Temperance Union meeting, which meets in town next Thursday. The union is non-sectarian, and it is hoped the town will be largely the comfort and entertainment of visitors. The committee on the dinner are Mrs. Samuel Taylor, Mrs. Homer Seavey, Mrs. John McMaster, Mrs. Emery Whitney, Mrs. Longley, Mrs. Cyril Blaney, Mrs. Quincy Day, Miss Louise Crosby, and Mrs. Alice Lambert. Next, we have the Forge Village section. Many other village people were present at the formal opening of St. Catherine's Church on Sunday afternoon. They had the pleasure of listening to Monsignor Teeling, Doctor of Divinity, of Lynn, the first Monsignor to be welcomed to the town of Westford. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met in Recreation Hall on Wednesday afternoon at the usual hour. Reverend A.L. Bumpus was the guest of the meeting. The regular meeting of Loyal Self-Help Lodge, International Order of Oddfellows, was held in Abbott Hall on Monday evening. George Emsley of Lowell was the guest of the evening and entertained the members of the lodge by a well-chosen speech. Joseph Bennett also entertained with phonograph selections. Miss Teresa Lowther and Miss Rachel Cherry were present at the musical festival held at Worcester last week. They were entertained during their visit by Mr. and Mrs. Baker of College Hill. Superintendent Frank Hill addressed the teachers of Cameron School at a meeting held at the school on Wednesday afternoon. Mr. Brackett, supervisor of drawing, also made a few remarks. John Spinner, Jr. has accepted a position in the express office at Ayer. Mrs. T. Thompson of Boston is the guest of Mr. and Mrs. George Kugel. The Sunday school teachers of St. Andrew's Mission are busy arranging for a children's concert to be held in the near future. Mr. and Mrs. George Kugel have sold out their boarding house on Bradford Street, which they have superintended for the past 17 years, and have set up housekeeping in Edward T. Hanley's tenement on Central Street, which is now West Prescott Street in Forge Village. Mrs. Miller, with her daughter and grandson, now have charge of the boarding house. The Jolly Six held a social dancing party on Friday night in Abbott Hall. A delicious oyster supper was served at intermission. I believe the Jolly Six was just a group of young ladies in Forge Village that held social events regularly. Augustus Carkin visited his daughter, Mrs. Casey, Caisse, whose maiden name was Maud Eva Carkin, of Leominster on Sunday. Howard Northrop has returned from a visit to relatives in the provinces. I believe the Northrops were from New Brunswick, so we're talking about the Canadian provinces here. Mrs. George W. Creasy, Cressy, of Salem, and Miss Edith Creasy of Los Angeles, California, have been recently the guests of their sister and aunt, Miss Elizabeth Plummer, of this village. Miss Creasy will return to California shortly to continue in her profession of trained nurse. Miss Grace Lawrence, who has been stopping at Maplewood, New Hampshire, has returned. She says that the presidential range is covered with snow, which looks to be a forerunner of a cold winter. We're talking about the first week in October here. Graniteville is the next section. Little Henry Payne, Payne, son of Mr. and Mrs. James Payne, was struck by a carriage driven by James B. Healy on last Sunday and knocked down. The boy was badly shaken, but no serious results are anticipated. Thomas Denio DENIO, the well-known station agent at West Chelmsford, had the misfortune to break his right wrist while cranking an automobile a few days ago and will be unable to work for several weeks. Mr. Crane of Springvale, Maine, is now substituting in his place. This was not an uncommon accident with early automobiles, which were started by turning a crank that was inserted in the front of the engine into the engine itself to turn it over. And when it caught, it sometimes kicked, breaking a wrist often. C.T. Kellogg, the state auditor, who has been at the office of the Abbott Worsted Company here for the past few days, received a painful injury by having a heavy limb fall on his head while walking under a tree here early on Tuesday afternoon. The wound bled quite freely, and Dr. Sherman, who attended him, found it necessary to take several stitches to close the cut. Mrs. Mary and Kitty Rafferty, who have spent the summer months at the Hawthorne Inn, East Gloucester, and Mrs. Annie and Lena Healy, who have been at the mountains, have returned to their homes in this village. Wallace Walsh is now at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, slowly recovering from an operation that was performed on his leg. Mr. Walsh has been lame for a long time, and strong hopes are now entertained that he will receive the full use of his limb when he is discharged from the hospital. The next and last section is entitled Formal Opening. The formal opening of St. Catherine's Church, an event that has been looked forward to with deep interest by the parishioners for the last few weeks, took place here at 4:30 o'clock Sunday morning. I'm guessing it should have been Sunday afternoon, but it does say 4:30 Sunday morning, and was largely attended. Last Sunday was Holy Rosary Sunday and was set apart for the formal opening. The pastor, Reverend Edmund T. Schofield, ever mindful of his parishioners, has secured Right Reverend Monsignor A.J. Teeling, D.D., pastor of St. Mary's Church of Lynn, to officiate on this occasion. And the people here had the pleasure of welcoming a Monsignor for the first time in Westford. Monsignor Teeling was heard in a very pleasing address, opening his remarks by congratulating the pastor and his parishioners on the fine appearance of the church. Reverend Schofield made a few introductory remarks, then the rosary was recited by Reverend Michael Doherty and the congregation, and then benediction was celebrated by Monsignor Teeling, assisted by Reverend Schofield and Reverend Doherty. The regular choir, under the direction of Miss Mary Hanley, assisted at the services. That's the news in Westford for the week ending October 7th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.